All right, so I said we were going to talk about cognitive biases, and I'd already mentioned the lecture objectives. The ones I think to really zoom in on in terms of just action-oriented things are like determine which type of bias is represented based on a story or case, identifying the common sources of bias. So those are all action-based things that are then linked to exam items that we'll have. First concept we'll talk about today is something called a heuristic. Has anyone heard of that term before? You took psychology? Okay, yeah. It's one of those intro to psychology terms, I think, or maybe even higher level psychology. But heuristics are shortcuts that our brains take to make decision making easier. So we oftentimes think that we are making decisions in a way that is completely unbiased, yet we're not, because our brain is doing the work on the back end to take the thought process out of it. For example, classic example, did you all decide what route to take this morning when you drove in? Now, how did you do that? Did you carefully weigh the options? Did you get a pro-con list up? Did you ask ChatGPT, Claude, whatever? Did you say, should I drive, should I go, this road or this road? Unlikely. We think that we made reasoned decisions about things, but we oftentimes don't. And that's, again, not bad. It is just a fact that when our brains are making decisions, we try to take shortcuts. So that's just kind of the broad picture. Another way that we think about this is whenever someone says a rule of thumb, it's just an expression that just means what people generally do in a given environment or a given situation. Those are based on heuristics. Now, there isn't like evidence-based medicine for it. There isn't, a lot of times strong data, and you're often wrong, but you're going to do it again tomorrow because that's just how it works. If we made the mistake of, I shouldn't have taken 64, I should have done this, we're probably going to do it again tomorrow, regardless of what happens. So there's some like prioritization that goes on there, like what I consider to be really, really important versus what I don't. I try to think about when I'm making a purchase, when I look into it and when I don't look into it. When there is a quality difference, like buying a television, for example, I do want to look into it. When it's like going and buying, ibuprofen at the store, I'm not going to really look into it all that much. I'm probably just going to make that decision. So a couple of different types of heuristics, and so I'm really going to distinguish here between heuristics and biases in the way that they actually get carried out. But the first, I've got three major types here. Again, this is not 100% complete. This is based on, I'll get to it in a bit, but the research of some pretty famous economists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. But they talked about, so the first one is representativeness as a heuristic. So this is making a judgment about the likelihood of an event based on preconceptions or memories of a prototype, stereotype, or average. So this is when you think that something represents something else. So that means, and again, this is not as significant, but have you ever met anyone from Guam, for example? Anyone ever met anyone from Guam? I just had to pick something random on the other side of the world. Let's say that you were on an airplane one day and you sat next to someone who said, where are you from? Guam. I've never met anyone from Guam before. That person, whether you want to or not, has become the representative of the people of Guam for you. Now just think through that for a minute, because it is. You ask questions as if they know everything about their culture. And it happens. Like, I think it's unintentional, but again, this is a shortcut to decision making, because when someone, so let's say you met that person and you talk to them and you're like, well, that was just one person. Let me go do a deep dive research in the people of Guam. Unlikely, unless you're just very curious about it. So what you've done there is you've shortcut your decision making. You've taken a representative of, in this case, the people of Guam, or the country, or the territory of Guam, and you have applied to them that they represent that group. And this happens across the board. People who are, LGBT, people who are from like certain religious groups, people represent the thing that they, and again, this is just the brain trying to shortcut the decision making, because we like to think we make these reasoned, really well thought out decisions when in reality we don't most of the time. Yeah. Say that again?
Totalization.
Totalization?
Totalization. And in this case,
I'm not following. What do you mean?
totalization is just having one case and you apply to all cases you know.
Oh, that's what this term representativeness means. It isn't necessary. We're going to get into the biases side of it, as in when that starts impacting our decision making. This is just a state. So we do this no matter what. And it isn't always bad because of the example of, like, again, you go into a Qdoba and you've gone into one Qdoba and the quality of that Qdoba has dropped over time. Your brain, whether you want to think it or not, is applying the performance of that Qdoba to the entire chain. All right. So that's kind of what I'm getting at here. That's kind of a benign-ish example. Like, that's not the end-all be-all, but then I hope you can see that the next steps might be bad. Like, if you did that progressively. But if I didn't answer your question, come up during the break or whatever. I'll answer it then. So the second one here is anchoring and adjustment. And I will pivot when we get to the biases. I'm going to pivot to how this can be bad in terms of decision making. But anchoring and adjustment is making a judgment using initial information that anchors an individual to a point, and then essentially moving about that point when it comes to the decision making. This is a very common thing. And the way I like to think about it is when we don't have context for something. So if someone said, I try to think about this with Celsius. So if any of you ever been to a country that uses Celsius as the main temperature, I still to this day do not understand what certain temperatures in Celsius mean. I do understand anchor points. For example, 37 degrees is body temperature, right? A fever is defined as a body temperature of 38 degrees, 1 degree over what your normal body temperature is. So you convert that to Fahrenheit, and a fever is 99.4 degrees Fahrenheit. That's how we got that value. So when I was in Dubai a couple years ago, I looked on the little thermostat thing, and it said outside temperature 42 degrees Celsius. That's real hot, because 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is 37 degrees. So I didn't even do the math then, but I anchored to that point. Now, I don't know what 17 or 18 degrees Celsius is. I'm not going to start arguing about it, but I just don't have a concept for that, because I kind of know what 0 is, because that's freezing. And then, kind of going that direction. But that's an example of the brain trying to find something to hang on, something to just point to. I need something that I can contextualize this with. We do it a lot when we, I know it kind of relates to representativeness, when we meet someone and we're like, oh, do you know so-and-so from this area? That's an anchor. You're trying to find an anchor point that you can fix whatever it is you're doing to. The last one is availability heuristic. And so this is making a judgment based on the information you have available in your mind, whether that is from memory, meaning something that happened to you in the past, or from personal experience. And again, a memory is a little bit separate from personal experience. A memory is usually a discrete event, like a specific thing, whereas your personal experience is your judgment about that, meaning that, like, I go to Qdoba, I'll just bring up Qdoba because it's right near my house. I go to Qdoba once every week, once every 2 weeks or whatever. So I often might combine experiences together and then use that as a jumping off point to make decisions about. That is not necessarily a memory. It might be a combination of memories. And I might misplace them too, because I might be confused with where I am. Side question, has anyone ever been working at a drugstore and the person, they're at the wrong store? Oh, I had this lady one day in the drive-thru. I handed you my prescription 30 minutes ago. Ma'am, I have never seen you before. I cannot believe this. She's every time I come to Walgreens. I have my CVS badge on, and she goes, ah! And then speeds off, like as someone does, like still flippant, not even apologetic about it. But in the idea of like being, compassionate and understanding about things, I might do something similar, hopefully not to that level of being like angry about it. But when I misremember things because like So for example, a lot of hotels look and feel alike, so you might not remember what hotel you were staying in because, oh, it could have been a La Quinta, it could have been a Fairfield, whatever. They all kind of blend together. That's more like your personal experience side versus a specific memory that you can really define. So that we just mentioned, when does a heuristic become a bias? So I have to think about what the term bias means. Now, a bias is when there is a tendency to prefer one thing over another that influences understanding or outcomes in a certain way. So we just mentioned, if you think about the way I described a lot of the heuristics, they were just states. They were just, this is a fact. I didn't necessarily use that as a mechanism or the main impetus for making a decision that has an impact yet. When I do that, that's when a heuristic crosses over to becoming a bias. So the problem is biases aren't necessarily bad. They're part of human nature. They are, again, ways that our brain tries to deal with the world that is very complex. We think about the word bias being bad because of it having a negative connotation. And sometimes it is bad, but not always. It is just, again, the next step past a heuristic when you start making decisions based on that information. So the reality is, whereas you might by default or just by human nature think a bias is bad, you have to think that the bias itself is neutral unless it leads to an undesirable outcome. That's the definition. So cognitive bias, kind of taking this a step further, is an umbrella term. So we're going to talk about a lot of different types of cognitive biases today. A strong preconceived notion of someone or something based on information we have, that we think we have, or otherwise we perceive that we have, or that we actually lack. Now, we oftentimes just, again, don't know what we don't know. You probably have heard that before. I don't know what I don't know. Very true. We do not know what we don't know. We have to think that there is a bunch of information out there that we just don't know yet. Whether it's known by anyone is a different story, but there's a lot of things that we just don't know. There are a lot of things I don't know. I can't quantify that usually. Now, if you ask me a question of like, do I know something, like example, do I know something about the geography of the U.S.? Yes. If you were to go and quiz me, I don't know if I'd get a 10-question quiz right about it, but I felt like I knew something about it. So that's a little bit of the gray area of how much do I think I know? Like, where is the gap between what I think I know and what I actually know, and then what's missing from that? Like, what do I not know? We sometimes find that out by quizzing ourselves, which is the example, kind of the inverse of what I just said. Someone quizzes me. If I quiz myself, I can find out what I don't know. But I have to know what questions to ask also, because if I didn't know a lot, I wouldn't know what questions to ask about it. Another example I give is, if you were to ask me, I took French in high school. Anyone take French? Oui, oui. So, yeah, high school was a long time ago for me. Shocked. I know you all. I'm not young anymore. However, I took French, and I have not been quizzed on it since then. But I aced it. I did like presentation, like 20-minute thing, all in French. It was great. So when I was in Strasbourg in March, Strasbourg is a French city, but it's in the Alsace-Lorraine region of Germany, where France, where Germany borders France, and it's gone back and forth in the last 1,000 years or whatever between the entities that were controlling either France or Germany. So there's a lot of German and a lot of French. So I went in this shop and I said, bonjour. And this person starts talking to me in French. Nope, I guess I don't know French. Thank you. I thought I at least could remember something. Donde está el baño? Oh wait, no, that's Spanish. Où est la toilette or whatever. But if you learn in foreign languages, you should learn how to say things like, where's the bathroom? It's kind of a classic trope. So I say that because that is something that I thought I knew, but I really didn't know. And it was really taking me quizzing myself to figure that out. In that case, it was someone asking me a question or someone trying to talk to me in French. All right, so heuristics are shortcuts we take to simplify decision making. A bias is the gap between what would be considered normal or expected behavior, meaning what a reasonable person would do, in a given situation, and then what our heuristically determined behavior does. That's when I talked about making a decision based on that information. Again, looking back on it, should I have, so traffic, for example, like you took the wrong road and you're in bumper to bumper. Should you have looked at the traffic report before you left? Probably. So you thought you knew everything. This happens a lot. My partner's he's been here for 20 years or 30 years and always likes to think he knows how to get around town. And I'm like, you do not know what roads are closed at any given time. Use your Google Maps. This is 2025. Don't be like that. We're not over this. We're not too good for using Google Maps. So now it's a point of whatever. We're driving somewhere and I've got Google Maps up on my phone and I'm trying to see if he understands he should look into, why is this road closed? I don't know. That's what I said. You should always be checking the map. So that's a side story, but it does bring up the point that we like to think we make reasonable decisions, and maybe 90% of the time, that's fine. You're perfectly fine doing whatever it is you thought. The 10% of the time, you're like, man, I shouldn't have done that. That was probably not a good move for me. All right, so why do we have cognitive biases? Well, the data, and I'm just using this term kind of loosely here, the data on this is really not reliable because the human brain is the most complicated processing system that we've ever seen, not because of what it actually does functionally, but because of the different inputs and all of the different complexity of what's happening. Imagine everything being in 3 or 4 dimensions, there's just, so I remember in math when you added in the z-axis for stuff, oh my God, so the brain works exactly like that. There's just stuff happening all over the brain all the time. So they've tried to quantify it though, and so you'll see different values of this. But we have the concept of bits and bytes and that kind of thing for a bunch of ones and zeros for our binary code, how that gets translated into what we can understand. But humans receive about 11 million bits of information per second, which is a lot. Not as much as you might think, but a lot. And then we can only process about 40 bits of information per second. And by that's including passive processes and active processes, meaning that right now you're unconsciously keeping your body upright. Hopefully, you're unconsciously doing that. If you had to constantly figure out, think about whenever you've been uncomfortable and you can't get in a position, that becomes your main focus because you cannot automate it. And so we get really frustrated when we can't automate things that we have been automating before because it then becomes a thing we have to deal with. Or, and I'm just saying this happens, something that has been there the whole time, you just say, oh, I didn't even know that existed because you weren't paying attention to it because it wasn't something that popped, right? It didn't jump out at you or it didn't show itself at you in a really impact, an inflection point type way. So in terms of influences on our biases, how we end up that complex decision making, how we end up deciding what we do and what we don't do, we have our individual motivations, social pressures, our emotions. If you've seen Inside Out, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's great. It's really breaking down how emotions work because everyone who thinks they don't have emotions basically handle them poorly because everyone does. And then our pre-existing limits on the attention that we can provide something. We just can't understand and grasp everything in the world. We just can't do it. It's just not how we're wired. All right, so our everyday cognitive biases that are out there. So these are just examples of kind of situations that you might see that could then be broken down into the types of biases. So only following people on social media who share your viewpoints. I make this joke all the time. Everyone's saying social media is so bad, you just don't use the unfollow, mute, block buttons enough because you can control your environment on there. It's really great. If I could do that in real life, I probably would. The Adam Sandler movie Click, where he can pause or go into anyway. That is something that people now have, not just me, but people have leaned into. I do have to realize I am controlling my world though. So if I think, well, no one does this, you just have a selected group of people that you follow, and then your algorithm. I made a joke with my niece a couple weeks ago when I was home. she showed me something. I said, our algorithms are very different. And I showed her something later, and she's like, oh, you're right. Our algorithms are very different. She was, for the Derby this year, she was like, did you see so-and-so TikTok star was at the Derby? And I'm like, I have TikTok, but I'm not on that side of TikTok, apparently. You all might know who this TikToker couple was there at the Derby this year. They made a big deal. I was like, never seen that person, does not pop up on my algorithm. So that is a bias, right? That's something that we have to understand is happening. The challenge is we don't always know that that's happening because we just look at what is presented to us. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that isn't presented to us that we don't know what that is because it's not presented to us. When trying to decide a restaurant to go to, you choose the one you recently saw an advertisement for. I'm notorious about this. This Popeyes down the street that they have gutted, and it's a tragedy that is not reopened yet, although they seem to be actually gutting it and replacing everything in it. So I'll give them that much. Advertisements for Popeyes work for me. Love that chicken at Popeyes. And I'm like, I'm going to Popeyes today or tomorrow. And I don't know. I just find like it's not that I had a great experience one time. It's like that advertising works for me. It's like I jump on it right at that moment. And so anyway, that's not logical. It just is what it is. So that's availability. Seeing a coupon for 50% off and thinking it must be a great deal. Do you all remember Bed Bath & Beyond? You would get 20% off coupons in the mail like every 3 days and just drop the prices about 20%. What is all this about? I bring in like 20 coupons and I can only use one of them on a transaction and it's much more expensive. The other things you buy are like, that is we'll talk a little bit about it when we get to that type of bias, but the sales, selling and kind of economic side of it, you see a ton of cognitive biases. Getting so much so that the marketing folks are just as much psychologists as psychologists are now, because it's just a different type of psychology. You purchasing something has to do with all of the different things we talked about. Social pressures, emotions, how you're feeling about what's going on in your life. And then you're not a professional athlete, but you believe all professional athletes are the same. I would also throw in, you think that you could make a better decision than the player or the coach. I was the last Georgia game I went to. My seats are up in the 300 section, so we've got a really good top end view. So I'm sitting there like the quarterback. Why can't he see that receiver? Because he is on the turf, like he's on the grass, and he cannot see the same thing that we can see. And I have to think about that because I can see things, and I have to think about the fact that the quarterback can't see things, right? That is hard. That's hard for us to think about because we get angry and we're like, I saw the receiver open and you didn't. And you either took a sack or threw it, to a different guy, or worse, like threw it and had an interception. So I have this link here at the bottom to a TED Talk that is one of the things that got the ball rolling for the modern, I'd say 2010s exploration of cognitive biases. It's a very good talk. So it kind of starts off as, are you biased? I am. And it leans into what we've just been talking about this whole time. Everyone is biased. And the key is understanding that you are and figuring out ways to deal with it, because otherwise it is just happening and you're not aware of it. So it doesn't mean it's not happening. It's like covering your eyes during a horror movie. Does it mean it's not happening? No, you just can't see it. So you at least voluntarily did that and you know that you're doing that. So that I put a link to it in Blackboard also. It's worth a watch. It's a couple minutes long in terms of just completing your understanding of all this stuff. All right, so I mentioned this research team before, but this is the seminal book in this area, Thinking Fast and Slow. And so Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, they were two Israeli researchers that really pioneered the field of what is called now behavioral economics. So all sciences, if you're a Big Bang Theory fan, I think I mentioned this a couple lectures, like they always talk about sciences, like whatever's applied this and all that. Behavioral economics is a modifier on economics. Economics is behavior, but behavioral economics is about how we make decisions. So if you think about economics as distribution of scarce resources, behavioral economics is how our brains make decisions based on scarce information. So it's really related if you think about the definition of it that way. So there are, in the Kahneman-Tversky model, it's called dual process or dual processing theory. There are two types of systems of thought. There's type 1, which is the intuitive, efficient, pattern recognition type of thought. That is I see 6 things in a row, the 7th thing, I can understand how patterns work. Type 2 thinking, on the other hand, is your analytical, time-intensive, deliberate decisions. It's what we think we do with everything when we actually do not do it with everything. If we did do it with everything, we'd be exhausted. I like to think about it as so y'all are on your IPPEs right now. If you have a shift that is, say 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever it is, and you are thinking a lot during that shift, meaning that you had to do a vaccine, administration plan for someone, or you had to look at a bunch of Medicare Part D comparisons, or you had to dig into something, you're going to be exhausted physically, which is really interesting because you don't necessarily think that, because I didn't run a marathon. I just thought a lot. So this is the problem that the body faces with overuse or excessive use of type 2 or type 2 thinking, because it is almost a physiologic approach to thinking, which is, again, kind of not what you might think of as a way to describe that, but it is a physical investment in the thought process. We don't really like that because it uses a lot of energy. And so we don't like being exhausted at the end of the day. So if you kind of carry that logic through, our body is constantly trying to find these patterns to shift things from type 2 to type 1, because type 1 is much more efficient. However, in the way we want to think about it, we need to think about how these two thought processes are not separate. They work together. I mentioned shifting things from a type 2 to a type 1. They can go backwards and forwards. Let's say in that example that I was giving about driving in, you did not think about what way you were driving in this morning, but you pull up on traffic and you go, oh my God, I have to figure out a different way to get in here. You're going to be more tired when you get to where you're going than you would have been otherwise, because you had to shift from type 1 to type 2. And so it's a much more labor and energy intensive process, but it's not wholly separate. The two types of thinking are not wholly separate from one another. So the fast unconscious thinking of type 1, we tend to think about this as where, when we call something intuition or reflex, we try to think about that. A sports example, I don't know, sports, I try to find examples that I think are applicable, but I was a tennis player in high school and college, and a lot of the practice, and this goes across all sports, a lot of the practice elements are trying to get the player or the athlete to shift from type 2 to type 1, because you cannot be successful if you're trying your hardest at every single thing. You need to have things, if you've heard of the term muscle memory, you need to have things in that, because you need to be able to use your brain power to focus on other things, like in the football example, of finding the receiver, figuring out what play is going next, remembering that play. Those might be closer to type 2 things, so you don't need everything in that because it's exhausting. You're just not going to be able to do it. So we are constantly looking for the patterns that shift the decision making from the analytical to the reflex. We're always looking for that. We're not always thinking that we're trying to look for that, but we do. Try to find a place for the first time. Oh, I'm going to find this restaurant, right? Find it for the first time. Second time you go there, it's a little easier. Third time, you might not even look. You might just remember it. Again, that is shifting things from type 2 to type 1. Yeah. So in terms of the origins and how we group type 1 thinking, we have a couple of things, I guess a couple of physiologic, genetic, kind of survival things, naturally selected processes that help with our survival. For example, sharp sounds. That wasn't loud enough, but that's sharp sound. Your attention goes to that, right? Gunshot. You hear something make things gunshot, your attention goes to that, right? That is natural. That's good. It's a survival strategy, because I might need to get out of the area. If there's a thunderclap, you get out of the area. That's a loud sound. Now imagine if you didn't have that reflex. It would be pretty bad. You probably wouldn't make it very far if you were running towards things that were loud and sharp instead of running away from them. We have our emotional processes, which is we have the 6 major types of emotions: happy, sad, fear, surprise, anger, disgust. You might have seen those like in the micro expressions area. But when you're talking to someone and they go, "I'm not mad," okay, Yeah, you are, but I'm not going to argue with you at that point because I've detected the tone of hostility in your voice. I didn't have to think about it, is what I'm getting at. When someone's really happy, you don't have to go, wait a minute, are they happy? Because you can tell from the emotional connection or the emotion, you perceive the emotions of the other person. Overlearning, which is where processes that become firmly entrenched or embedded in our behavior due to their repetition over time. And that's called overlearning. So in medicine, one of the classic examples of overlearning is in the emergency department. You might have heard the term frequent flyer, someone who's in there a lot. That is overlearning because it is something that, while it may be true, is really not great for the patient or the provider to think about because it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't make any of the situation easier. But it is type 1 thinking because you didn't have, when you see someone who's been in the ER 6 times in the last 2 weeks, frequent flyer, you didn't have to analyze it to make that assessment. That's an example of overlearning. And then implicit learning is a bias that it's acquired unconsciously. So things like gender, race, that type of thing. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. So where is type 1 thinking occurring? Mostly in the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. And so that's the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area. Now, dopamine, right? Dopamine is our, not happiness necessarily, but it's our reward system. So think about the times where you have done something automatic, like when for in tennis, when I was hitting the ball and it went right over the net and, just person didn't have time to touch it. I didn't try really hard to do that, right? I didn't, it's just because it was natural. But I got a dopamine hit right away because that's how that pathway works. The dopamine keeps me rewarded internally for shortcutting things. And this is the bad part. So let's say your muscle memory. So in that case, instead of hitting it right over the net and it going right in, what if I was over hitting everything? And the outcome was still, so the process was still automatic, but the outcome was not great. That's going to disrupt me and it's going to shift me into type 2 thinking, and it's going to be a lot harder for me to do it. So I don't get that reward. I don't get that surge of dopamine because the pathway for type 2 is a little bit different. All right, so type 2 thinking is where instead of intuition dominating, you have reason that dominates. It's our classic, this is what we think we do all the time, yet we don't really do it all that much. So it's activated when we encounter something that we have either not seen before or we don't recognize, or it shifts us out of something that we did recognize to something that we don't. So this is, if you're waiting on someone to come home, and I know that this sounds really weird. Dogs, I have a dog. Dogs know what our cars sound like and what, the pattern of things. We do too. So if someone pulls up in your driveway at your house and you hear a diesel engine, it doesn't sound like someone who lives here. So it jogged you out, it pushed you out of type 1, automatic thinking, into what is this person? Who could it be? So you go up and you try to figure it out, especially if they're wanting something from you. There are some other examples that are not as blatant. So one of the ones that I liked is maintaining a walking speed that is faster than what is normal for you. So is anyone here a fast walker? Okay. It's kind of a trope or whatever that people are fast walkers, don't like people who are slow walkers. And maybe vice versa. I don't know. I think the animosity is a little one-sided on that one because I'm more of a mid-range to slow walker. And so even though I have long legs when I'm walking, I will stop the person. Are we in a hurry? Do we need to get somewhere? Okay. What's all this? Why are you doing this? Oh, I'm sorry. I'll slow down for you. Don't slow down for me as a courtesy. Why are you walking so fast? Are you running from somebody? But why is because I can't walk faster than I would normally and carry on a conversation at the same time because I'm having to keep my pace up, right? I'm having to keep it faster than normal. You notice, though, if you've ever had to do that, sometimes you can shift it into type 1. If you get enough of a pattern, 30 minutes of walking, you're walking faster than you were before, and you're able to carry on the conversation. But that is further evidence that you are shifting your thought process around it. Filling out a tax form, hopefully you are using type 2 thinking and not automating that. because you need to make sure that either you get all the refunds you can get or that you pay all the taxes you can get that you're supposed to. So hopefully you are using it. Another reason why people don't like it all that much, because the end point is you getting your money you were owed back, but you have to do all this type 2 thinking that's exhausting to be able to do that. And you're worried about doing it wrong because it's logical to worry about doing it wrong. Comparing 2 washing machines for all of I could have said televisions because I was doing this the other day. Our television in our main room went out. And so I'm like, I hate buying TVs because I do not know what all these terms mean. And I feel like I could make a really poor decision. So, but this is exhausting. It is exhausting to price and quality compare things because it involves so much type 2 thinking. And then I put checking the validity of a complex logical argument, like everyone's doing that all the time. But it is like if someone says something, you're like, wait a minute, what did you just say? That's you checking the logic of that, and it's type 2. You have to you heard them, but you're like, wait a minute, what did you say? You have to repeat that because it did go in, but you were not hearing it. You were not actually being able to process it. So where does type 2 thinking occur? A little bit of a different place. So as you might imagine, type 2 thinking is kind of one of the hallmarks of humanity because your average run-of-the-mill cheetah doesn't overthink things. There was a book probably about 15 years ago now that said why zebras don't get ulcers, and it was really like talking about stomach ulcers and how stomach ulcers come from stress, and stress is particularly not unique per se, but particularly prominent in humanity because of the way our brains work. The frontal lobe is what makes us mostly human. It's where we do all of our deep thinking, where we get a lot of our personality from. And the parietal lobe is just behind that. So those are the 2 areas where type 2 thinking occurs. And this should make sense physiologically because that's the most recent evolutionary part of the brain is the frontal lobe in the forebrain area. All right, so I mentioned how the systems interact before. So it isn't always planned, meaning that some of the shifting in between type 1 and type 2 is automated, and it's effective because we need it. Meaning that in the example I gave of driving, and you see like flashing red lights, you do not need to automate that. You need to pay attention. And so sometimes there are things like speed bumps that are there to knock you out of type 1 because you get automated until you get the speed bump and you're like, oh crap. And then you shift into type 2 and you're being more aware of what's happening. So that's closer to what might be called a nudge or like a clue or trigger as opposed to something punitive, a speed bump is, because everyone is at risk for not paying attention in a certain situation. Everyone's at risk for that. However, like we mentioned before, the brain is really just hardwired to push as many tasks as possible from type 2 into type 1 because it's exhausting. If everything's in type 2, you're exhausted. It takes way too much energy. However, we don't know we're doing that, and so we think we're being analytical about everything. We do, and I mean we as in I do it too. I think I thought through that. Bullshit, you did not think through that. That was not how that worked. You automated that thinking. I do the same thing. Everyone thinks that they are more analytical than they actually are. So an example of like what I was mentioning before about creating skill acquisition, a lot of coaches, and especially the sports psychology people, talk about this aspect of it. When you are trying to become better at your sport, your goal is to automate a lot of the technical side of what you do so that you can use your brain power to make better strategic decisions. So for example, in tennis, where your feet are positioned is in a lot of ways a strategic position or a strategic choice, but you need to make good decisions at any place where your feet are positioned. So you have to figure out what part of it I want to actually decide and consider, and then what part I need to be automated. So in that example, I need to be able to get muscle memory, good ball control, good form, no matter where I am, because otherwise I'm going to limit my choices, because if I know I can't hit a very good backhand, I'm never going to want to hit a backhand. And so I'll position myself in a way where I don't ever have to hit a backhand, except for that you can't do that, so I just miss those, or they hit the net, or whatever. One of the other things that, in terms of being careful about it, is debiased thinking. So biases that negatively impact judgments, we can override them, meaning that if we realize what's happening, So if we think that we are, okay, so I'm in Costco. And Costco is a good example of this. Costco is a sale-oriented company. Like they're a store that is oriented around sales, like as in discounts on things. Like it's cheaper to buy in bulk. I go through and I'm thinking, God, 17 boxes of Cheez-Its for $20. That's great. That's a great deal. I mean, I just made that up. But that's a great deal. For me, it's Legos. So if I go down to Costco here and I just roll onto the back, on the middle, go down the Lego aisle, get some samples on the other food stuff, and then I'll go out. Get my hot dog and my soda. But in an environment like that, we have to sometimes realize. So if we go in and say like, hey, this television's $100 off. That's a good deal. Is it a good deal though? You can shift yourself out of it. You can say, you know what? I need to actually be analytical here. I don't need to just rely on this information. That's called de-biased thinking. Now, it takes effort because you have to realize what's happening and then you have to shift your thought process around it, which means you have to have time to do that. You have to have the energy to do that. If any of you have kids or a family that you're having to like make dinner for or decide what to eat, I saw a meme the other day that was like, no one told me as an adult that all I would be doing is figuring out where I'm going to eat and what I'm going to eat and how I'm going to eat it. Plan for the meal, plan for the next meal, lay out whatever it is. No one told me that that was what adulthood was like because, of course, as a kid, most people didn't have to think about that all the time. So we like things to be easy, right? So we have Taco Tuesday because what do we eat on Tuesdays? Tacos, right? That's an easy way to think about it. You have to decide that. Famously, like Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg, which I think he's different now, but those were folks who wore the same outfit every day to work. Like they wore the same black shirt, gray shirt, jeans, whatever. I mean, this may be something you were aware of or not, but they said it was because they didn't want to have to make decisions about that. That is a waste of their time as in their roles, whatever they were at the time, to make those types of decisions. So what they did is instead of having an analytical process, they just automated. And, you know, that's however you want to perceive that, that is leveraging these types of things to potentially help us if we think through that. Biased thinking, on the other hand, is excessive reliance on type 1 thinking can actually override type 2 thinking, meaning that if you are, again, in Costco and someone, you know, you're like, I think I saw that TV at Walmart for cheaper a couple months ago. Oh, but we got to go to Walmart and we're already here and I don't want to have to deal with all that. And then I don't think it's right. Okay, well, I guess you're probably right. It's probably a good deal. Like that's someone really easily pushing you from type 2 to type 1 because of all the other factors that go into it. And so we can then almost know that we're leaning into biased thinking and not be upset about it. I make different decisions when I'm tired or when I'm sick, and I think we all do. And it's probably because we don't want to have to think about things. Like I will eat junk food like all day when I'm sick. I don't want to have to think about anything else, and it makes me feel good. Even though on the net, it probably doesn't. A handful of Snickers or whatever is probably not good for you. But I don't want to have to think about it. So I chose then to shift myself into type 1. Here's an example from medicine that I really liked. So one of the things, when I talk to students about decision making, you may have encountered this on your IPI or not, but you will eventually at some point. Physicians, providers, clinicians, everyone is always trying to look for patterns. So when you are doing self-care in the future, you are going to be like hearing people. You're going to hear, you know, someone you may have already heard it describe their symptoms in a consultation. You're looking for patterns, right? You're looking for things that you recognize. That is system 1 and system 2, or type 1 and type 2 interplaying, because you go, okay, so you've got drainage, it's allergy season. You look like you're congestion. You might need a decongestant. What if someone then throws a wrench in to say, well, I tried a decongestant, it didn't work. Ooh, okay, you're back into type 2, right? So you're going along, you're trying to find a pattern, and then you can override it if you want to. Sometimes you reach a point at which you're like, I don't have any more ability to respond to this. Like you've reached the limit of my skills, you need to go see a provider about it, or to Minute Clinic or something like that. But this is a process. This looks mechanical, it looks like technical, and it kind of is, but it represents that interplay between the two systems. So we're using type 2. We listen to people. I listen to people. I worked this past weekend, and I'm hearing people talk, and I'm looking, what have you, all right. Have you tried this? What have you done? Okay, I have an option for you. What do you think about this? And they might throw a wrench in to say either they already tried it or they don't want to do that. Okay, I'm back to type 2, right? I'm like, I can't always rely on being able to find something automated, something I know about, so then I sometimes have to reason my way through, okay, well, here, try this. If this doesn't work, do this. If this doesn't work, do this. That's complicated, right? It's hard to explain to people. You don't always, sometimes they just want a simple answer. As you might imagine, when I'm working in that environment, when someone comes up and they say, hey, can I take this? I don't answer yes or no. Does that surprise you? I don't answer yes or no. I typically go, oh, hey, look at the product. Go, what are your symptoms? What are you trying to deal with? And sometimes what they've picked up is not useful at all. Like the decongestants that we have, there isn't a decongestant available now, by the way, over the counter that's even remotely effective. Sudafed is essentially the only decongestant. You have to have a ID for that and get it behind the pharmacy counter. So if someone presents this, I'm like, that doesn't have a decongestant in it. You described congestion. If I could have just said, yeah, you can take that, they're not going to get better. You know, I use that as my impetus for like shifting into that type of decision making. But I do try to use it to help the patients out. All right, let's take a quick break. Let's try to come back a little before 5 after the hour.
Like the first set?
All right.
Second set?
So let's go back and talk about the types of cognitive biases. So I mentioned that we would get to this where we would talk about how those heuristics can go into places that make us make not desirable decisions. And so this is what this is about. The first one is implicit bias. And so this is probably the one that's gotten the most attention, I think, in the last 10 years or so because of society and cultural things. But what it is an unconscious collection of stereotypes and attitudes that develop towards certain groups of people that can affect patient relationships and care decisions. So I think controversial isn't the right term for it. This is something that everyone is either at risk for or has a tendency to do. Again, it's that representativeness component of like, I see someone who in my head represents a certain group of people, and I think everybody from that group acts the same way. It may be that there are some truths to that because pretty much everything in the world, there's a little bit of truth to it, no matter what it is or how ridiculous it is. So in terms of why this is bad, we end up having poorer interactions with people because we're really not listening to them. We're listening for things that slot them into our preconceived notions about people, which is just an interesting way to think about it because we're not treating them as a separate whole person. We're treating them as a collection of stereotypes when we do those types of things. They affect treatment decisions, treatment adherence, because this is more like a patient-centered. Have you all talked about motivational interviewing yet in communications? You will. I mentioned this before. You'll talk about it. But one of the things that one of my sayings that I use is like, what's the best drug is the one that the patient will take and that they understand is important and that they are aligned with the goals that are set, because I think that's a missing piece in a lot of the interactions that we have with people. We project onto them what we want them to do, but we don't ask them what they think about things. We just assume that they have the same values and goals that we do, and that might not always be the case. So implicit bias example, you probably heard this before. A father and son are in a horrible car crash that kills the dad. The son is rushed to the hospital. Just as he's about to go under the knife, the surgeon says, I can't operate. That boy is my son. Catches people off guard because the idea is that the assumption is that a physician is male as opposed to the possibility that the physician could be female and then that boy could be the surgeon's son. I've heard that many times before. I don't know if you've heard it before. It's kind of like one of those TED Talk level of like examples. But this is from 2019. There was a survey that showed female physicians in certain settings, particularly primary care, are assumed to be nurses. I think surgeons have a lot less interaction with people when they're awake. If you think about it, I had my rotator cuff repaired last year. I think other than the 2.5-hour surgery, which I was not there for, I was asleep. I had probably about 8 minutes of interaction with the surgeon over the course of the entire time that I was in the care. So yeah, that's a little complicated because it's hard to make judgments about people in that short amount of time. But in those settings, there has been a good bit of data supporting that those types of biases exist and that they are potentially impactful on both the quality of life and the quality of care for the patients. So the second one is confirmation bias. So this is I won't say textbook example, but I'm actually guilty of this on a regular basis. And I'm going to just confess that I do this regularly. Tendency to look for confirming evidence to support a theory rather than look for disconfirming evidence to refute it. So if you don't think you do this, go back and look at some of your search terms and histories and things like that, because I did when I was prepping this. There was a paper that I was writing that I typed out a sentence and then I went to the search PubMed and I searched for the type of study that I was looking for to support my assertion. It's literally confirmation bias. I am not looking for the answer, I'm looking for something to support my assertion. Now, of course, I would argue, well, I've done literature search into this before, I just don't remember the study. Well, that's not true. That is just not true. I think I liked the idea of saying something and then citing it, But we do this a lot, and I think it comes from a place, again, of wanting to be accurate or right, but not wanting to do a ton of work for it, meaning that we want the easy. So this is an example of like the politics angle. So this newsstand has two different sources of news. They have blue news and red news. And the blue news people go to the blue thing. They're at it again. I knew it. And the red people go to the red news source and they go, what rubbish are they saying now? It's the same information, right? And this is one of the problems. Is the spin that's put on it is very different than perhaps what the actual facts of the situation are. Look, this study shows my opinions are actually fact. This study has flaws, and I will find them. Those are the two sides of the same coin. So you might have watching something or watching two clinicians. Well, what about this? What about this? Well, what about this? And they're basically coming from a perspective. They decided what they thought before they got in there. When someone, you might encounter this when someone is presented with information that goes against their worldview, that they don't either acknowledge it or they think it's fake. And that's a problem. And that's like long-term enabled confirmation bias over a source of time. So a medical example would be just a 25-year-old patient who presents with abdominal pain and headache. The labs are non-specific except for an elevated white blood cell count. In that case, the bias that would lead the physician to treat for infection, even though the patient only has one potential evidence point for that, and several other parameters to rule out. This is when I was talking before about wanting to shortcut things. The way our models work for payment in the U.S., we don't get paid as healthcare providers in our case unless we dispense a product, but in the case of physicians, unless they get a diagnosis. So they are really incentivized to jump as quickly as possible to a diagnosis. That is, all the incentives are lined up for that. They're not actually incentivized to help you, even though that might actually help you. They're not incentivized to help you. They are incentivized to get to a diagnosis that they can then bill for. That is how our medical system is set up. All right, anchoring bias. So this is, I mentioned this before, just in terms of finding something to stick to, for lack of a better analogy. It occurs when a person relies too heavily on the first piece of information given about the topic. And so this does tend to run hand in hand with confirmation bias in the sense that sometimes it can go from anchoring into looking for information that supports that. And that's what I mean by the interplay between those two. So I've mentioned toaster here, but I'll throw out the example of a television. Shopping for a toaster, first one, or shopping for a television, $1,200. Oh God, that's really expensive. Well, the next one is $200. Whoa, that's really a lot cheaper. That's when you don't have a context for things. This happens a lot when people haven't bought a car in a while, and then they're like, oh, cars cost this amount, because you don't know how much they cost unless you go buy. So then you go and look at it and you go, wait a minute, cars are really expensive now. That is ridiculous. And you realize, well, all the cars are that way. There was a big article a couple years ago that the last model of new car that was less than 20,000 is now discontinued. I think it was like a Mitsubishi Eclipse or something like that. But all cars now new are more than $20,000, which is crazy. I mean, it's reality, but it's like if you didn't go buy them, or if you haven't been looking for a while, you might think that things are the same as when the last time that you looked for things are. So in this example, though, you can lose the context of what the reality is based on the anchor. Where the anchor points exist, you can think that, oh, well, I've got 3 different products here, and that they're all around the same amount, so I guess this is how much it costs. If you ever get quotes for like work that's done on your house, this is a really bad thing that happens. We had a quote for electrical work a couple of years ago, and I was like, this is ridiculous, you know. I go and like I got 4 different quotes, and they're all around the same, and so I started talking to people, and they're like, oh, yeah, you can't go with a brand that advertises. You have to go with somebody that you know. And sure enough, I found a friend that had an electrician that did great work, and it was like a third or a fourth of what the big, you know, like Tom Drexler or whoever the big dogs are that advertise. And that is the way it is. That is always the way it is. And you see some of that when people are like posting on social media, hey, I need some recommendations about this. That is good to do that because the advertisement allows them to charge more money. In fact, one of the entities I got the quote from, when I told him, I was like, this is like way more. And he goes, well, you're paying for the name. And I'm like, oh, why do you even have to say that? You do not know me all that well, but that is the worst thing you should have said in that moment because I can give less than 2 shits about the name. I want the work done. I want good work. And I don't care about who, you know, the brand that did the work. It's just not my thing. So in medicine, this is an example from the UK, but it was talking about referrals to a medical unit in England. They were looked retrospectively across just a slice of time, 16 days. They looked at information that was available from medical intake forms, so like potential diagnosis, signs and symptoms. Because when someone comes in, even to the emergency room, there's always a triage that happens, and that's a quick assessment of what's going on. It can be biased by what the patient reports, meaning like they come in and they're reporting like gastric pain. Well, that could be a symptom of a heart attack, depending on what's happening. They're not going to say I'm having a heart attack in that example. So it can be a little bit deceiving when you only rely on the patient information, but it can also be a little deceiving for the providers when that initial diagnosis comes in because it becomes an anchor point. They basically have to refute or support the presumed diagnosis as a part of their medical process. So in this example, this study showed the junior doctors, meaning like the ones who were not significantly experienced, were more likely to arrive at the correct diagnosis when no potential diagnosis was given on the medical intake form. So essentially what that said is that the junior physicians were more influenced by the potential diagnosis than a seasoned provider would be. And maybe that makes sense, maybe it doesn't. I had to kind of think about it for a little bit because sometimes being really experienced at something can present its own types of biases, but it also allows you to see times where that did not work for you. So think about how powerful the lessons of doing something incorrectly are. Like, you don't ever have that happen again. You have other creative things that happen, but not that thing again. So a senior physician in this example might have been more likely to have had that backfire in the past, and therefore understand that they shouldn't use that potential or potential diagnosis. So both of those sets of providers were more likely to reach the correct diagnosis if just given the science and observations, period, rather than a potential diagnosis, which is really interesting because it goes against the kind of the conventional wisdom of how these types of settings work. They love being able to shunt people into pathways, codes, right? Like a code blue, or at Baptist it was like a team C, or a team D was like a stroke or an MI or something like that. That's a pathway, right? We activate things. That is type 1, right? That's automated. We need to fulfill that goal of getting them the care that they need. We have to make sure we're doing the right thing, though. We have to make sure that it's actually what we think it is. All right, availability bias is a disposition to judge as being more likely or frequently occurring if they readily come to mind. So I think this is interesting. This is where a lot of the way the media works right now comes into play, because the news has to report. They have to broadcast several times a day. If you ever watch like the morning news, depending on how long you have it on, they repeat stories about every 20 minutes. That's because that's the length of time people normally watch it. They have the data about how long their average viewer views. So they know that's basically when they need to start repeating things. The weather is a good example. It's not going to change between 7:20 and 7:50. It's going to be the same forecast, right? Because unless there's a new model that just came out, they still probably don't even have time to analyze it. So I say all that because usually they have to find something to do. They have to find something to report. And I'm a big aviation safety person. I haven't emphasized it as much this quarter, but I love the analogy of aviation and healthcare. But aviation is a really good example of something where the news does not begin every day with 6,000 flights safely departed and landed today. In other news, if there is a crash, it makes the news. But what they don't talk about is how all of the other planes landed safely. So that's biased, right? Because you only get the information that they choose to provide wherever it is, whatever media source it is. And they don't always provide that context of, generally, aviation is the safest way to travel. It is absolutely the safest way to travel, period. There is no safer way. What we don't, so like this morning I was watching a little bit of the news and there was like, there was a fatality car accident. Literally every day in every city, there's like people that die of car accidents. And we have a handful of people that die of plane crashes every year. But we have thousands and thousands and thousands that die of car crashes, and we're not afraid to drive. So that's an interesting dichotomy there. Like, why is that the case? So in terms of availability, we have to think that we are presented with curated information, no matter what it is. We're presented with textbooks, right? I write textbook chapters. I decide what to include in the textbook chapter and what not to include. You all, when you go to your materials, like let's say you're working on something, you decide what to include in whatever materials you provide. If you're telling a story to a loved one, you decide what details to include in the story, right? Generally, they're ones that make you the hero, and I'm not saying that's bad. That's what I do. Kind of gloss over the things that you did that were bad. Well, that was and you skip over it and you go to the next thing. But you have presented biased information at that point, right? You have decided how the other person should feel about your information based on the way you're presenting it. So it's human nature. So here's an example: crime in America. So every time there's something that comes out about crime, I'm actually giving a lot of respect to the media, because they will say, well, yes, there is crime that happens. However, trends are, and this is where this like availability component comes in, because in America, Americans, this is from the latest data is from 2024, Americans tend to believe that crime is up nationally, but not up locally, which is really interesting because everywhere is local to someone, and then national is national for everybody. So how is that the case? That's kind of like, well, everyone does this thing, but I don't. Well, if everyone thought that, then no one does it, because you don't do it, and you're everybody, right? You are an example of everybody. So this is an interesting thing that's happened over the course of time. So back in like even 2000, the percentage of people who believed that crime was up was less than half, and now it's both local and national. It is up. Now, where's the reality? I'll get to that in just a second, but this is actually a big political difference here. So between 2021 and 2024, the percentage of people who were polled who say that reducing crime should be a top priority for the president and Congress to address in 2024, the percentage has gone up. Okay, so that tells you that the public perceives crime as a problem. Here are the actual crime statistics. So between 93 and 2020, 2021, 2022, every report of every crime across the board, no matter what it is or where, has gone down significantly, like beyond even what could be attributed to chance. Crime is way, way lower than it was. Now, does this mean it's not a problem? No, of course not. Let's say you're trying to lose weight and you are 50 pounds overweight. You lose 20 pounds. Are you still overweight? In your head, you are. Have you made progress? Yes. So are you worse off? Well, you might think so because you're not as low as what you should, but you're actually better off. You just have a different frame for it. You have a different presentation of it. So another problem is that people weren't alive back then or don't remember how bad things were. So like in the 80s, oh God, the 80s crime was awful compared to what it is now. People, I mean, kidnappings were everywhere. I mean, it was, and I'm not saying it happened in a lot of places, but it was way higher than it is now. So that's a problem, because how do you say it's still a problem to address without acknowledging the fact that it is much better than what it has been in the past? So there's tons of articles about this, like all of the statistics show that crime is lower, so why does the public still think it's a problem? This is something that politicians and lawmakers have struggled with, because laws only do so much. There's comprehensive policing, things like that, but the perception is still really bad. And in this case, perception is reality, because if people believe that crime is a problem, they're going to make decisions that support or refute that. And so it's just kind of an availability thing. There is some data about people not believing the stats, which is really interesting. Like, they're provided the information and they don't believe it. So there's nothing else at that point. There's nothing you can do if the person does not believe the information is real. All right, so availability bias from a medical standpoint, that was more of a societal standpoint, but from a medical standpoint, patient comes into the emergency room with shortness of air. During the pandemic, one of the challenges that was faced was that most people who came in, especially when they were at their peaks, probably did have COVID. They also might have had other stuff. And the challenge is that the other things, meaning like they had heart failure, and the COVID was more likely to throw them into a heart failure exacerbation. So did they have COVID, or did they have a heart failure exacerbation, or did they have both? Because the treatments would be different. The treatment for the underlying condition might be different than the treatment for the viral infection. So one of the things that I think got a lot of criticism but came from a good place is treating everyone when they came in like they had COVID. So that was, if you had to go into medicine, like the healthcare system at all during the pandemic, it was really bad. Because everyone was checking temperatures. It was more like a paranoid type thing, and not to say it wasn't effective, because those are good strategies, but I think it kind of doubled down on this idea that if we treat everybody like they have COVID, we're going to prevent, we're going to actually make an impact on the spread. But the risk is that we overdiagnose, that we over-attribute, and that makes some of the statistics a little harder, because if you look at, especially like New York City was an epicenter during the pandemic, they had a ton of COVID. Now, in that time period, people still had heart attacks, people still had strokes, people still had heart failure exacerbations, and that killed them. The COVID, though, accelerated it. So that's a problem, right? Because they would have maybe died anyway. They wouldn't, there's no counterfactuals, no way to prove they wouldn't have died. So that just makes it a little more complicated to look at what you do about that information later on. All right, recency bias is similar to availability bias, but it occurs when a person most easily remembers something that has happened recently compared to something that occurred further back in time. So availability versus recency. This is something that I'll go over here in a little bit, but it's essentially why we separate out recency is because there is there's a tendency over time for the memory of observations to fade, meaning that when you are first exposed to something, whether it's information or a situation, it's fresh. So we talk about things being fresh. For example, if I had a friend of mine who was shot and killed, I'm going to think that everyone is going to be shot and killed because that's the most recent thing that's happened to me. We see this with like shark attacks and things like that, where people are like, I saw a shark on the news last week. Okay. Do you think that makes it more likely that they're going to come after you? Are they organized now? Do they have a front that we're trying to fight against? No, but it also is, again, human nature. So I like this graph because it talks about the actual hazards on the bottom and then the perceived hazards on the top in terms of where the public outrage is. And plane crashes. Public outrage, huge, right? actual hazards, not even measurable in terms of just where it falls. I mean, plane crash, it's not even in the top probably 5,000 causes of death that you would have in this country. It's just not. Yet people, if you polled them, are terrified of flying on planes, you know? So terrorist attacks, another one. And this was, especially after 9/11, there was a big outcry of, oh, terrorist attacks were such at risk for them. Again, the reality is that we don't have as much risk for that as we think. On the flip side of it, heat, cancer, car accidents, they are killers in this country. Car accidents, like accidental death, is like one of the leading causes of death in the country. So the leading cause of death, I think, for kids below like 16 or 17 is either violence or like accidents or gun violence or something like that. Not plane crashes and not terrorist attacks. So the things that we get a lot of attention for fearing aren't necessarily the reality of what causes the most damage. All right, here's a recency bias pharmacy example. KG is a pharmacist working at a local hospital. In a hurry, she checked medications that were sent to the pharmacy by the ER physician. The next day, another physician called and asked, why is this patient receiving ibuprofen when he is experiencing an acute kidney injury? Because that's not something you would do. After looking back, KG realized she forgot to check the patient's labs indicating renal function. So she realized she made a mistake. After this instance of getting burned by not checking the patient's renal function labs, KG always double checks now before verifying ibuprofen. Now, this may seem a little bit gray, but hear me out. Have you heard of the term fighting the last war? Something you've talked about before, like when something bad happens that you, on retrospect, realize you should have anticipated, that goes to the forefront of your brain to not have that happen again. And anything that goes to the forefront pushes other things out. So if you think, in this case, this pharmacist was like, I'm never going to do that. She's going to look at the renal function for every patient. What if the renal function isn't relevant for that next patient? What if it's the kidney or the liver function instead? Or what if it's some other metric that she didn't think about? That's where that recency, that freshness of it comes into play. So availability and recency are different because of the time factor. So recency is really close in time. Availability is something that's either constantly present or something that's perpetually present that is then reinforced every time. So like, oh, crime is a problem. Well, why does the news lead off with a crime every single day? It's because they wouldn't lead off with the safety things. We're like, oh, 500,000 people arrived home safely today. One person did not. You know, like that they're not, that's not a story, right? It's not dramatic. People don't like that. So you get really disrupted or, you know, discombobulated with the way that the facts are presented compared to reality. Self-serving bias is when we attribute positive events and successes to our own character or actions, but then when negative results happen, we blame external factors. If your team wins, you had the best game plan, the best execution. If your team loses, the refs were awful. Ain't that right? That's right. Refs are bad. Now, I will admit, if any of you are college football fans, the Georgia-Auburn game a couple weeks ago was the worst officiating I've ever seen in my life. The guy ended up getting suspended. The main ref did. But yeah, I mean, we won, so I like that. But I agree it was bad officiating across the board. However, if we had lost the game, I probably would have been more upset about the officiating than if we won the game. That's like an outcomes-driven approach, which I think is really interesting because from a learning standpoint, like in this example, I get an A+, I'm smart, right? I got an A+, I'm the smart person. If I fail it, the teacher doesn't like me. I mean, how many times? You may have even experienced that yourself. That was unfair. I failed. That was unfair. But you can't take credit for the successes and blame other people for the failures. That's self-serving bias. And it's pretty common, honestly, it is. Premature closure bias. Anyone ever seen Office Space in here in the movie? It's a great movie. It's an older movie, but it's really great. So one of the characters had like an idea for a jump to conclusions mat. And so like kind of presented it against this mat up here. You take the start and you jump to the conclusion. So you jump to what you think the end is going to be. It's just a really funny thing that comes to mind when we think about this type of bias. But what this is the tendency to cease inquiry, cut it off, once a possible solution for a problem is found that then may lead to incorrect conclusions. So this is really common in medicine because of this tendency to want to find a diagnosis. So they're really looking for a pathway to get to a firm diagnosis. And that could then cut off their thought process around what it might not be in that example. So jumping to conclusions, incomplete investigation accounts for a really high proportion of misdiagnosis in medicine. So example, patient presents to the outpatient clinic with a red, itchy rash on her lower leg, diagnosed with poison ivy, prescribed a cream, and told to report back in 3 days if it didn't go away. 3 days later, reports back with the same non-improved rash, and another poison ivy cream is prescribed based on that first diagnosis. So the provider said, well, maybe you just need a different cream. 3 days later, a patient notifies the office that she is in the hospital with cellulitis. It was not poison ivy, it was an infection that was undertreated because of that premature jumping to the conclusion that it was some kind of poison ivy rash. So that is kind of a classic example. All right, so here is our first case. So this is the examples of the ones that I've put on Blackboard. You'll have stuff like this on your exam. So Jacques Benveniste, a French scientist researcher, invented homeopathy after becoming convinced that if histamines were diluted, they became more effective because of water memory. It's a fun thing to think about. He used unreliable methods in his studies, and other researchers proved this hypothesis to be false. However, he continues to support his study and disregard other evidence. What type of bias is present there? Who says A? There is just one answer, yep. Who says A? Who says B? Who says C? Who says D? E? F. Okay. I think what you're getting at with the self-serving component is that he was really confident, right? So that isn't quite the same thing though. So the correct answer here is confirmation bias. Now, why is it confirmation bias? He did not want to look for things that did not support his hypothesis. Even though other researchers had disproven it, he ignored it. Confirmation bias. He's only looking for information that supports his hypothesis. So the key there is in the person's head, they are looking for things that support the way that they thought. If the example instead had been that when his research was disproven, he blamed the editors, and when it was accepted, he thought he did a great job, that's self-serving bias. All right, example 2. Women are 3 times less likely than men to receive a knee replacement despite comparable indications. So which one is this? We can hopefully just say it. B, that is implicit bias. Because it is a characteristic of a group, so in this case, women, but it doesn't have to be just women, that then leads to outcomes that are undesirable. So in this case, women are less likely to receive a knee replacement despite the indications and the circumstances being the same. That's an example of implicit bias. All right. After seeing several TV shows about shark attacks, you begin to think such instances are relatively common. Anchoring, implicit, confirmation, premature closure, availability, or self-serving. So tell me why you think D. Yes. Okay. So the correct answer is availability bias. Okay. The difference would be premature closure would be like, I'm trying to think of a counterfactual example. So let's say that you're looking for what, I don't know. Jumping to a conclusion would be like, I'd have to think of something that would make that in premature closure. But really, it's about ending the search. So I'm going along, and then I find something I like, and then I stop looking, period. So I've prematurely closed off what's happening. So this one's actually a lot more applicable to medicine, premature closure is, than the other ones probably because of that tendency to go for a diagnosis. That isn't the same in all areas. Like not every discipline has to go for a diagnosis immediately. Some have the more freedom to like actually figure out what's going on. All right, Mike's study found that 70% of doctors believe the freebies that they received from pharmaceutical companies influenced other doctors' prescribing decisions, but only 18% thought it affected their own actions. That is correct. Self-serving bias. That is, I make good decisions, even though other people do not. I'm a good driver. Everyone else is a bad driver. Everyone thinks that. Literally, everyone, even the bad drivers, think that they're good drivers. There's not a person that's like, I'm a really crappy driver. And that would be kind of odd to say. All right, so where do we get our cognitive biases in the clinical setting? Now, this first one here it's called base rate, which is, I have it linked out here if you're curious about this topic. Essentially, what the problem with base rate is when we are looking at a situation, we don't always know what is expected in that given situation. Meaning that there are examples of something that seems odd that is actually really common. That's called the base rate. So when we think, oh my God, this is crazy, this is ridiculous, it's because sometimes we don't know what we should have expected to see in that given situation. It isn't always the case, but this is going back to that representativeness component. If we saw, so for example, I've got Scottish heritage. We were just talking about that. Scottish people are tall. They have red hair, like Brave, right? Like what was her name in Brave? Merida. Yeah, that's a Scottish person, right? No matter what. So what if I meet a Scottish person who doesn't look like that? I don't understand that there is a percentage of people who do not look like that in any country, no matter what it is, right? There's a percentage of people who just don't fit the stereotype everywhere. I mean, yeah. I, on the other hand, am tall, and I've got red facial hair, and my last name is Malcom, so I do fit a lot of those things, but not everything. And I think that's the base rate. So that's what we're talking about with base rate, is because we don't know what we don't know. And so if we're only presented with a couple of examples, we don't understand what the underlying reality is. Organizational factors, meaning like how, like in the case of billing, like you have your physician and they schedule in 10-minute increments, so you only have 10 minutes. That's an organizational factor that's going to facilitate the use of biases or the employment of biases. And then our education and training, which is what you all are doing right now, because if you understand that this happens and you can intercept, then you can hopefully make better decisions. The last two are case specific, meaning like in an individual case, we can sometimes use the information appropriately, and sometimes we can use the information inappropriately. Meaning that in like the premature closure example, we go down the list of trying to find something. You all will encounter this when you do your patient case workups in lab next year. I've been sitting in those and I get to a point, everything in the case is relevant, by the way. There's not anything in there that's not relevant. So there was a case that had like GLP-1 inhibitors as an option for diabetes, and the patient had a history of medullary thyroid carcinoma, which is a really weird cancer to have. It is one of the few contraindications to GLP-1s. So I knew that they weren't going to get it right when they go down the list and they're like family history, non-significant, social history, not, or other medications, not significant. Okay. Yeah, they're not going to get it. And sure enough, they recommended GLP-1 when they get down to the case. So they have presented the information that disregarded that really key part, right? I know why they thought what they thought. All right. So risk factors for cognitive biases, this is about the locus of control. So when we think about what we have control over versus what is external to us, the example that I gave about like providers being scheduled, or in our case, like vaccines. So I was working this past Saturday and we had vaccines all day. They scheduled them like 2 every 10 minutes. So that is a workload factor that is an external component. It still is important, but I don't have any control over that, or very little control. Distractions, I don't have very much control over what's going on in my environment. And then the team resource management and even things like social pressures, peer pressures, I don't have as much control over those things. Internal though, I do have control over my body, how I get sleep, how I deal with emotions. I do have my own risk tolerance, meaning how much risk am I willing to tolerate. That's the balance between accepting risk and not wanting to accept it. And then my knowledge, training, and experience. All of those are factors that could either enhance my decision making internally or could be a potential barrier. So cognitive bias is bad. Are we bad? No, we're not. We all have them. They're natural. They're part of everyone's life. So what can we do? What we're doing right now. We can become aware that these biases exist and then recognize that every human mind uses them. So we have to understand when we're using them and not think that we're somehow special and that we don't use them. We all do. So then we have to determine how to mitigate or lessen the impact. So that is a pivot to how we become aware of our cognitive biases is something called metacognition. So metacognition is thinking about one's thinking. It is thinking about how you think and how you approach the world. It is inception. You remember the movie Inception? It's like a dream inside of a dream. You were like, I made that decision and it was not a great decision. How did I approach that decision? This is huge. I mean, if any of you come to meet with me about exams or we talk about things in the future, I'm going to talk about this because it is very, very important to think about how you were thinking about something. If you are thinking about it in a productive way versus if you're thinking about it in a way that is not productive or a way that distracts you or a way that adds additional barriers that aren't already present. So there are two different entities of metacognition. There's metacognitive knowledge, which is the learning about how we think. And there's metacognitive regulation, which is figuring out ways to intercede or intercept that thought process. So there are three different types of variables in metacognitive knowledge. There's person, task, and strategy. So this metacognitive knowledge component refers to what individuals know about themselves as thinkers, cognitive processors, and then what approaches can be used. So you're learning about what you can actually do. So that's the knowledge part of it. So a person variable, how one can assess their strengths and weaknesses. This is sometimes very hard. I think it's something that we don't give enough credit to. It's very difficult. So one of the things I do is I watch my lectures. That's painful. I was here, I don't have to live through it again. But I watch them because I'm trying to get better at it. If you ever have to watch film, so that's another sports analogy, watch film of you doing something stupid, you're like, I don't want to watch that again, because it's very hard to watch things where we don't do what we're supposed to do in them. But it's very important for these person variable component. Task variable, what one knows or can figure out about the nature and time demands of a task. What is it that is being asked of me, or what is it that I want to do? That's the task variable component. So there are caveats and things that are influenceable or levers like change, things that can be changed as a component of the task. And then strategy. So strategies, the strategies a person has at the ready to apply in a flexible way to accomplish a task. Let me use this as an example. So if you're studying and you have a couple different ways that you generally study. You have one where you copy your notes over again. You have one where you quiz yourself and others. And you have one where you just read. Those are three different strategies that could be employed in different environments, maybe for different courses, maybe for different content. You deciding what strategy to use is a strategy variable. So you need to have those available for you so that you're not necessarily having to learn new things when you're trying to make these types of changes. So this is a graph that kind of represents all of those processes, asking yourself how you think, how you learn, what are the steps I need to follow, what do I already know about this topic. I mean, telling you guys, when I'm talking to students about something and I ask them, I say, what do you know about this? And they're like, I don't know anything. I find that very hard to believe. I find that is very difficult for me to believe. You know something. Let's start from what you know. It just backfills then. And they're like, oh, I actually do know some stuff. But what I think happens is this imposter syndrome comes about where if you don't do well on an exam, you get shown for not being smart or whatever. And that's again kind of like an intrapersonal thing. It's a real element, but it's also something that is very important to figure out how to get past. The second part, so knowledge was the first part. The second part is metacognitive regulation. And so this is helping students understand, clarify their understanding rather than just getting through the assignment. I cannot stress to you all enough how critical it is that you understand the things you're learning. Now, what do I mean by understand? I mean that you know them backwards, forwards, inside, outside, up, down, in reverse. Because that shows that it's going to stick with you moving forward. If you just memorize and purge, it doesn't do any good later on down the road. It becomes like a phone number. You hear a 7 or 10-digit phone number, you write it down, it goes in and out. That is the same idea as if you cram and forget. You are going to regret it later. So one of the ways that we do that from a curriculum standpoint is we put you in experientials, because hopefully you are applying that information on a regular reinforcing basis. You are hopefully able to put what you're learning into practice, because that helps put it in a place in your brain that can actually be recalled later on. One of the things I do when I'm learning about drugs is if I'm struggling with learning a drug, I'll go grab it off the shelf and I'll look at it a long time. I'll like open it up, look at the pills. Oh, that's a really specific pill. Benicar, which is olmesartan, has a popcorn smell, which is really interesting. Spironolactone has a mint smell. There's a whole subsection of pharmacy on the smells of drugs, like metformin smells really bitter. But I remember them that way because it's salient. It's like I know what that drug smells like, and I can actually remember it because of that. That's a practical use of your experiences. So students that have good metacognitive regulation can select appropriate learning strategies for a task and modify their approaches. Example, if you did not do well on an exam and you think, I just didn't do that strategy well enough, okay, try it again, I guess. If it doesn't work a second time, really hope you don't think you just didn't do it well enough on that second time. I hope that you're able to understand that you probably need to pivot to a different strategy. That is very hard for us to do because it admits that we did not do it correctly to begin with. It goes against our egos. It goes against our whatever type of inner, self-worth that we have. Oh God, I did not do that right. I've got to pivot. I've got to do something different. All right, I mentioned cognitive debiasing before, so I won't go over this in too much detail, but what this is a process for you to get past those barriers. So your bias is triggered, you get aware that your bias is being triggered because like in the sale example, you're trying to find a good deal, you're like, oh, I'm being tricked by this, okay? What are you gonna do? Motivated, you gotta figure out if it's worth the time and investment to pivot, to do all those kind of things, and so those are a stepwise approach. Examples from the classroom setting, look at your exams and don't just look at the questions you got wrong, look at the ones you got right too, because here's the problem. When you were on the exam, you do not remember what you were thinking about in that moment. You do not remember if you were guessing, truly guessing about it. When someone guesses and they get it right, they are validated that they had it all along, even though they would not have bet any money on it. They would not have put anything behind what that was, but they're like, oh, I knew that. I definitely knew that. Bullshit, you did not know that. There is no way. The betting example is actually something that researchers are trying to figure out more of because it's something everybody can understand. Like, I'm gonna say this is my answer, but I'm not confident in it, so I'm not gonna bet any money on it. If you got it right, you were not confident on that. You did not know that information, even though you got it right. You did not feel like you knew it. You did not believe that you knew it. All right. Thinking out loud, when you're thinking about a complicated subject, talking out loud and talking through it, I recommend that across the board. I do it all the time when I'm trying to figure out things. I'll go to Dr. Esposito's office and I'll like, hey, help me walk through this. Your friends, your partners, your family members, they're all great for that. They're just, if you can run things over with somebody, that is very, very powerful. Reflection. So hopefully you're getting something out of the critical reflections that you're doing, because the idea is that you're able to say, what is it that I'm actually going to do with this information? What does this actually mean? That is an activity that is very impactful for cementing the knowledge, is I need to create a plan for it. It's kind of like if you wanted to run a marathon, you can't just get out and start jogging. There's a plan for it because you have to have a goal, you have to have time frames, you have to have accountability. Those are the reality of this type of decision making. In the experiential setting, I won't go over this in too much, we're a little bit over, but I will say that the same types of approaches, so this questioning and feedback, I really strongly recommend that. If you are working with your preceptor to say like, hey, what have you observed about my behavior that you either like or that you think could be improved? Because otherwise they might not tell you exactly what they're observing, but it's very helpful because you are in a learning state. You are in a position where you have a potential to make a difference in the sense of how you decide to make decisions. So that's a very important thing that you could do, is ask your preceptor or ask the people around you to tell me when I'm doing something that's wrong. All right, questions? All right, thank you all. The test should be released, so just go ahead and do that. Just do not be like a person who comes back later and says, I did not get full credit for this. And I'll go, well, did you get all the questions right? Oh, shoot, I forgot to do that. Don't do that. Go through as many times as you need to get all the questions right. Let me know if there's anything that is unclear.